My guest today is Bo Bowen. Bo is a licensed pharmacist who started out working as a pharmacist, but after a few years switched careers to become a certified financial advisor. In that capacity, he focused on advising individuals and families planning for retirement about the nuances and complex considerations of planning for healthcare and health insurance in retirement. His primary work was advising clients on healthcare financial planning. And he did that on a non-commissioned basis, which means he wasn't getting paid to sell insurance plans. His firm was just charging for the financial advice, so he would have been in a position to provide objective advice squarely aligned with the client's interests. After several years of financial advisory work, he left the financial planning world to go back into pharmacy practice, where he's been working since. So he's seen the practice of healthcare from both the provider side and from the financial planning side as it relates to health insurance planning. So that's why I'm excited to have Bo on the podcast today, because I think he has a really unique, relevant background and can bring a unique perspective to helping early retirees think about health insurance planning in retirement. So hope you enjoy this conversation, and let's jump into it. Thanks so much for taking the time to chat with me. How are you doing?
Yeah, doing good. I've been enjoying your podcast. It's been a lot of fun listening to episodes. So I think you're one of maybe 3 podcasts I've listened to every episode and been pretty religious about listening. So it's been good.
Oh, nice. I'm glad to hear that. And hey, by the way, I apologize. My voice is really hoarse. I normally don't sound this way, so this is definitely going to be. It'll sound different, but I can still talk. So, glad to have the conversation today. But I have my water.
Hey, no problem. Yeah, I've got a bit of water myself. I was worried after the cold weather this morning, running and below freezing weather was going to be a little difficult on the lungs. So, but thankfully, my voice isn't quite as raspy as yours.
All right. Well, we'll see if I can get through this. I think I should be okay though.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe where I'd love to start is by just understanding a little bit more about your personal background. I understand you're working in pharmacy right now, but you were working as a financial advisor before, specifically advising on health insurance for retirees. So, could you share a little bit about why did you decide to specialize in health insurance consulting as a financial advisor in your prior career?
Yeah, good question. So, I'd always been really interested in finance in general. I guess, had a really privileged upbringing, not in terms of financial resources being handed to me, but financial lessons. So, I had, for example, my first job was when I was 15, in I think 98 or so, 99. And my grandmother was like, hey, if you contribute to this new thing called a Roth IRA, I'll match you, for the first, $500 you put in or whatever. Just so some early lessons with finance and early investing kind of got me interested in that. And so I went to pharmacy school, really just knew nothing about drugs, but decided that's what I wanted to do. Thought I could make a pretty good living. Graduated in 2009 with the doctor of pharmacy degree. And so started practicing pharmacy, did that for maybe 7 or so years, worked for Walgreens a little bit while in school. And then afterwards, once I graduated and, along that way, I was just, by default, almost probably saving 70% of my income and really not really thinking much of it, just because I was used to living really as a college student for 7 years while I was going through school. And so once I kind of realized hey, this hobby of mine's really been helpful to friends around me and so forth. I thought, oh, let me transition and do financial planning or get into that industry. And so joined a national brokerage firm, started advising individuals and families on just broad investment topics, retirement accounts, retirement planning, that sort of thing. And then realized how much I did know, just when you're faced with other people's circumstances that are totally different from your own, like older folks looking at estate planning. I hadn't even thought about estate planning, right? Just wasn't anything on my radar. So I started kind of just seeing other people's perspectives, led me into trying to fill those gaps in my knowledge, because I just wanted to learn more. And I guess to get to your original question, a big gap was, health insurance planning. I just had always taken it for granted that, I had employer coverage, and felt like, that was one of those topics that wasn't really covered much. Even once I did do the CFP, or Certified Financial Planner curriculum, only about 17% of that exam even covers any health insurance or, insurance planning. And of that, a small subset is, Medicare, employer, COBRA, on exchange, off exchange sort of insurance planning. So I decided, okay, well, this is good. I'm enjoying working with families, but where can I kind of figure out how to become an expert on that area? And so I started doing some online research, and there's really not a whole lot of options. But the industry is such that, you hopefully work with a trusted insurance agent and who you feel has your best interest at heart. And the model has historically been that, you buy a insurance product of some kind, and a commission's paid to that agent for recommending a health insurance strategy to you. And you hope that they've got, a wide range of options, and they're choosing the best one given the information at hand. But I realized that model is sometimes conflicted. And so I kind of sought out other options, and I really only came across a couple in the country that do health insurance advice on a fee-only basis. And so I applied for a job with that company, working basically directly with other financial planners, trying to kind of come up with tailored strategies for their clients. And so that really, the financial planners were our clients, and then we just essentially gave advice to their clients on behalf of them. So that was kind of in a way, that business model sort of forced upon us by the fact that there's not really a regulatory framework for, giving advice when the product itself has an embedded commission paid to whoever sells that product. So it's a little difficult to hold yourself out to the public like, hey, I'm gonna give this great, fiduciary level advice to you based on, specifics of your situation. It's a little difficult to do that. So there was a company based in Nashville, Tennessee, and that's, where I live. I was doing that, so I thought, great, this is no better place to learn more about this kind of, niche. And so did that for a little while. Kind of realized, felt like I was pretty competent with that, and decided then really just to transition back into active pharmacy practice, just because I happen to have a good opportunity with a friend of mine. But I'm kind of running on now, so maybe
No worries.
we could dig into some specifics there.
Yeah. How long were you in the role where you were doing health insurance specific advisory work? How long was that, I guess, period?
It was under a year, I would say somewhere between 6 months and a year, I think. That's really where I felt like I got all the benefit I could in terms of the education aspect. And then it was just, this sort of more mundane, taking on quite a big workload in terms of serving clients. And yeah, so for me, it felt like I wasn't really progressing knowledge wise. I was just doing a job at that point, which, kind of the point of financial independence is to, do what's meaningful and fulfilling and where there's growth, and not so much just slaving away or toiling away doing something that just for a paycheck or whatever. So
Got it. So, and how long were you a financial advisor, just all in, both the pre-health insurance part and the post?
Right about 5.5 years, something like that.
Oh, okay, got it. So, so the health insurance portion was the back end of that, the last 6-12 months. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. And what made you want to eventually then switch back to the provider side as a pharmacist?
Really just the culture, the people that you're surrounded with on a day-to-day basis. I had an opportunity to join a um, company called Fresenius Medical Care, North America. They're a big dialysis provider, um, and really, like, to be honest, it was just a chance to join a really good team. I had a close friend who's been a close friend for over 10 years, who was hiring a team of pharmacists, and I said, "Great, I can work with her." Yeah, I also had some influence in terms of talking to some of the other people who were being onboarded at that same time, and kind of encouraging some different applicants that eventually got hired. And so kind of came with, a team of people that I really enjoyed working with. And the culture of pharmacy is such where there's just a certain personality that's drawn to pharmacy. Oftentimes, it's kind of people with servants' hearts that are, just pretty, um, yeah, just good people. I think in general, not to say that there's a reason for this, but there's oftentimes, different polls that show pharmacists as one of the more trusted professions, and financial advisors are usually kind of the opposite, right? Maybe less trusted. Insurance salesmen as well, maybe not highest on the trust rankings, and that's for a reason. I think in general, there's different cultures around those different industries, and I was kind of tiring of working for other financial planners, who oftentimes would, just kind of, they weren't really putting the client first in a lot of cases, and it just grated on me because why am I, doing this work for people who really don't deserve, the work and the effort I'm putting into this. And trying to take care of their clients, so I'm making them look great, and trying to give good advice, but then, they're not really the type of people I want to work with. So that's probably the majority of that. Not to be negative, but I think in general, just surrounding myself with good people that I enjoy working with was the main driver of that.
Yeah, it makes sense. And and my wife would agree. My wife, by the way, is a pharmacist as well, so, and has been her whole career. And so she's definitely the good one in our family, the servant heart in our family, I think. um, okay, well, I would love to get into some of the kind of nitty-gritty tactical aspects about what retirees should know about health insurance planning. And maybe to start, would love to get your thoughts on, like, what do you think are the biggest challenges that retirees, and especially early retirees, face when it comes to healthcare planning?
That's a great question. I mean, broadly, I'd say it's just ignorance, right? I mean, certain assumptions that everybody has about health insurance, where what's the expression? It's not what you don't know that hurts you. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. I don't know if that's Mark Twain or somebody said that. That always stuck with me. That's really true with health insurance planning. I'll give you a quick example. So I had an emergency call working with that healthcare financial planning company I worked with, and it was a gentleman who had just lost his job. He was scheduled to have a surgery, later, about 3 weeks away, the following month, and he's no longer employed, and he had always been told by colleagues or by friends, or just, if you lost your job, you'd often assume that, hey, I've got access to Cobra. This will be no big deal. I just pay my premiums. Maybe they're not subsidized like they previously were, but this will be fine. I'm already scheduled for this surgery. I'm just gonna, pay a little bit more for a couple months, get that surgery done, and then figure out what's going on afterwards. Maybe get a new job, whatever. I'll figure it out. This gentleman worked for an employer that had under 20 employees. He had no access to Cobra whatsoever. And when we started doing the research to see what other options were available, he quickly found out that his provider was not in network for any Affordable Care Act compliant plans on healthcare.gov. So it was sort of like, okay, now I've got to, maybe talk to their billing office, see if there's any, cash pay discount they might offer me. Maybe I need to look into seeing a different provider, which he didn't really want to do. This surgeon had followed him through other procedures. So it's things like that where I think you just have to do the planning ahead of time. Know your situation, know the landscape in your given zip code, county, or state, and just really stress test or game plan that scenario out before it happens, before you're faced with it, and kind of know a bit about. And that might be things like looking at like a simple website like either KaiserFamilyFoundation.org, KFF.org has a lot of Q&A sections, and that has some state-specific information that's helpful. Also, healthinsurance.org, another decent website that will have like a state-by-state sort of overview of the landscape in different markets, so you can kind of familiarize yourself with, okay, what options even exist in this area, especially if you're moving, or there's just a lot of things like that, and it's very specific to the area you're in. So I'll give you another quick example. So there, had everything was an emergency, but had a financial advisor email me and say, this is very sensitive. I have a very valuable client who has a daughter who's gotten pregnant unexpectedly, and she has no health insurance. What does she do? And I was like, well, first off, if your client's worth tens of millions of dollars, I mean, don't you think you just pay a few $1,000s for the delivery? I don't know, that's just me. But beyond that, it's sort of like, okay, well, where does she live? In New York, pregnancy is a qualifying event. You can get health insurance on the exchange just from being pregnant. That's not the case in most states. So it's very, very specific to your locale and your situation, and kind of what's important to you, and the doctors you want to see. So
I see. So it sounds like your geographic location is really important. Are there kind of tips that you would suggest that transcend where you're specifically located, for given that it's easy to mess this up? Like, what are some of the tips or important things that soon to be retirees should be thinking about and considering and planning in advance when it comes to getting ready to transition off of employer insurance coverage onto whatever the case may be? Like, let's say they're not yet ready for Medicare, they're not at the age yet. But what are some of the things that they should be considering as kind of just like basic strategy?
Yeah. Okay. So basic building blocks, I'd say, is know exactly what your unsubsidized rate for your COBRA would be. If, like, for my employer now, we've got a few different options, but just as an example, we have an option that's $10 every 2 weeks as your premium that's taken out of your check. The unsubsidized cost of that's about $700 per month. And COBRA typically can be up to 102% of that unsubsidized premium. So know kind of roughly, okay, I'm going to be paying about $700. Should I elect COBRA? It's real simple to use KFF.org subsidy calculator, or just healthcare.gov subsidy calculator, kind of gauge, what sort of income situation, you're in or could be in the future, should you transition into early retirement. And on that topic, some of the basic tax planning is super easy, in terms of setting aside some cash, ahead of that date, potentially, depending on kind of, it is quite, well, I won't say difficult. It's difficult if you've never done it to forecast sort of a marginal rate, including the impacts of subsidies on the exchange, versus your pre-retirement, or before you leave work sort of marginal tax rate, just comparing those two, and trying to make them more level, and not realize so much taxable income while you're working that you're, paying unnecessary taxes relative to what's forecasted for the future. But also, it's oftentimes real easy, to either while you're on Cobra, for either 18 or 36 months, depending on what qualified you for Cobra. It's real easy to realize some income because in theory, you may be on Cobra, you're not earning that paycheck from the job. You're able to maybe realize some income from your IRA or from 401k, some other taxable money, capital gains, et cetera, where you can just, live on, basically that basis that's been realized over that period of time to bridge for future years of subsidies. I guess other just important things that are pretty basic is just kind of understanding the landscape in your market. Like, hey, what options are on the exchange, for a given calendar year? What options are off exchange? What does my Cobra look like? And what is maybe other employer plan options, your part-time work or whatever. What do those options look like? In a state like Tennessee, we're really lucky because we've got, well, either lucky or unlucky, however you want to look at it. Unlucky for the ill-informed, but super lucky for the informed. We've got Farm Bureau options in Tennessee where, they're not considered health insurance because they're sort of a member organization that's, you've got to join in order to have access to, but it functions very similarly to other insurance, except they screen out individuals based on pre-existing conditions. And they also they're not compliant with the Affordable Care Act, but otherwise function pretty well as health insurance. And, they'll be really quite affordable. That's been operating in Tennessee longer than any other state, since about 1993, I want to say, if I'm not mistaken. So Texas has recently, I think, got an option with the Farm Bureau in Texas, maybe as of last year, pretty recent. Indiana has that. There's several states that, maybe around 6 states in total, that have that option. So again, just knowing your local landscape is important. So looking at, some of those basic websites to just understand what's available is good.
So in your prior role, how would you help soon to be retirees choose the right plan if that is the outcome that would typically happen? How would you help them navigate to get to the right plan that balances, their needs, their budget, et cetera? Because Cobra, it's finite. It'll run out at some point, and sometimes it's quite expensive. So you might be looking at the Affordable Care Act marketplaces. You might be looking at just the private market, which could be very expensive. Or you might be looking at doing like a part-time work, like you said, to qualify for healthcare. But how would you, I guess, typically step by step walk a would-be retiree who's like, maybe not as knowledgeable and they just need a framework? I don't know if you had a framework or a step-by-step process that you would follow to get them to the right plan that balance their needs and budget. How would you do that?
Yeah. So we basically would create more or less a slide deck or PowerPoint presentation, and we'd basically start with, okay, what drugs do you take? All right, write all those down. What providers do you value? If you see, primary care that you're attached to, or you see specialists that you have a relationship with that you don't want to lose, okay, let's take that into account. And then from there, we just basically make a grid, that would show in network, out of network, with all the different plan options. So we basically just manually investigate every health insurance offering in that zip code where they lived. If they had multiple residents in different states, we'd consider, okay, how willing are you to spend more than half the year in this state versus your current state, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of manual work involved, basically, in terms of just finding out which doctors fit into which network. So that was a big part of it, just making sort of a grid that said, okay, here's all the doctors, here's all the different networks, whether it's the UHC Choice Plus network, or if it was some other, Blue Cross network, whatever contracting that the doctors would do. We would outline that first. So that oftentimes would knock, and it would depend on the person, right? So some people say, I don't care, I'll just go to whatever doctor, I see is fine with me. I don't have any particular ties to anybody, or they're moving to a new place, in which case they haven't met anybody, in which case we just send them, different options and kind of inform them about what was out there, what the different networks look like, and so forth. But a lot of times people say, I have to go to Vanderbilt, if I'm in Nashville, or I'll have to go to the Mayo Clinic, or, I have to have access to those networks because I value the quality of care at those places. And that would knock out a ton of plans, frankly, just right off the bat. And then from there, it became a little easier to kind of compare cost versus coverage, and okay, do you want more of the high deductible style plan? How valuable is having an HSA? The tax savings with that, and then just go from there. And narrow it down further based on the specifics. And
Makes sense. Does that then become, if not an annual, I guess, consultation that they come back to you for? I know you're not in the role anymore, but like, I guess a role like that, does it become a situation where the client really should be coming back, if not annually, then every few years? Because, the drugs you take may change, where your retirement location is, like where you want to stay, may change. I mean, you might make plans to, I don't know, be closer to your grandkids or something like that. And that may necessitate rethinking some of those insurance choices, so that you don't get left with a surprise when you need to use it and realize you actually can't use it for, one reason or another. How would you recommend retirees, I guess, revisit on what type of cadence should they revisit this type of assessment or consultation with
yeah,
their financial advisor?
that's a great question. The way that was structured in my previous role is that you would have a pretty routine annual check-in, and then the way it was structured also is that you had sort of unlimited access during the year. So if there was a new drug, or you're having problems getting covered, if it required a prior authorization, or even a more in-depth formulary exception where you needed some additional steps to have the drug covered, we were kind of on call for those sort of things as well. Sort of a white glove service all around. But yeah, I mean, at minimum once a year. And then anytime something major changes in your life, oftentimes, the healthcare spending is not, you look at sort of the average medical claim, you might see some articles about the average medical claim is $2,000, and everybody has in their mind, oh, okay, just set aside a few grand, I'm fine. It's not the average, and sort of the tails are, it's very skewed, in one direction, where you have huge spending on, some acute conditions that can occur. My current role is a perfect example of that, where, we only have about 500,000 dialysis patients in the country, but the average commercial plan pays about $250,000 per year for those patients. Medicare pays maybe 80,000 a year for those patients. And so you talk about having acute kidney injury, you take too much ibuprofen, or you have some other illness or injury, and suddenly you find yourself in a situation where you're spending a whole lot of money. And that everybody has cancer in their mind, or different examples of costly illnesses. But that's sort of, obviously you would revisit when there's any major change in your health situation.
Yeah, makes sense. Do you think the considerations change at all depending on if you're planning to retire in your 50s versus 40s or even 30s? Like, in what ways should the age at which you're planning to retire influence how you think about or plan for health insurance coverage? Or does it? Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's the same framework analysis.
No, it does. I mean, there's definitely a tremendous amount of uncertainty around how, not just the cost now, but how those costs will evolve over multiple decades. You look at, Medicare spending in general, and you sort of know that intuitively, like, hey, this is not something that I'm going to be able to project really cleanly over the rest of my life. Um, and part of that, you know, um, if you think about sort of just a simple example that comes to mind, there was a news article maybe within the last let's say the last month, that talked about the surprise announcement that Medicare Part B premiums were going to decline, year over year. From last year to this year, it went down about 3%. Or for this coming year, 2023, they're going to lower them about 3%. And everybody's sort of like, well, how did that happen? Healthcare spending keeps increasing, about 4 or 5% a year, and yet Part B premiums that cover outpatient, doctor's visits and outpatient services, medical services for retirees, are declining. And really, that was due to just one drug that's covered as an infusion, an IV infusion, called Aduhelm, for early on or early symptoms of Alzheimer's. That one drug wasn't utilized as much as was projected. And so you're talking about one single drug for one single condition having a 3% impact on the costs that everyone faces in the entire country. It's
That's
kind of a
crazy.
mind-blowing kind of example of how just small factors can impact things. I mean, uh, other changes like that are coming in the future. I mean, there's a lot of policy decisions that are trying to control costs by shifting more of the burden to Medicare. Um, Another example of that is that there's some Part D covered drugs that are in the next coming years going to be covered under Part B, as boy, um, simply because Medicare Part B can control costs better, and because they're a single payer, they can just dictate what they'll pay for drugs. Whereas the Part D landscape is sort of this hodgepodge of private insurers that are all sort of really unable to dictate price to the drug manufacturers. So policymakers' solution to that mess is that, oh, well, we'll just, kind of quietly, for certain conditions, certain drugs, slowly take oral medications into, like, for dialysis patients, saying, okay, these certain class of drugs are going to be covered as just a payment from Medicare Part B rather than being covered under the outpatient drug benefit. And so
Oh,
um,
wow.
the drugs that are cost, tens of thousands of dollars a year will now be covered under Part B starting, in the next couple calendar years. And so you really can't forecast, what policy decisions are going to be made. So you just sort of have to try to, the best you can, sort of understand what those drivers are of cost, and try to set aside enough money to navigate it. I mean, I don't know. Fidelity publishes that sort of annual report that lots of people cite of, okay, age 65 married couple is going to spend X amount, on medical services through retirement. And they say, okay, 65 married couple, 30-year retirement, what is that going to cost? And I think it's up to $313,000 or so. And they kind of break that down and say, oh, 17% is going to be prescription drugs, and they say, okay, maybe 39 or 40% is going to be premiums for Part B, Part D. The remainder is going to be your out-of-pocket expenses, co-pays and co-insurance and so forth
But
for
to your
medical.
point, those are averages still, right? So if you're the unfortunate dialysis patient, you could blow through that in a year, maybe, So
Oh, exactly.
yeah, given the uncertainty and, like, I guess especially the uncertainty if you end up retiring early, are there any, I guess, tips or suggestions you might have for how a would-be early retiree can have some semblance of, like, analyzing their situation, like at least semi-quantitatively, to try to uh, forecast what their healthcare costs are, or anticipate, for, I don't know, out of band costs. Maybe there's not. I'm just trying to see if there's like, I guess, any better suggestions that we could provide to listeners around, like, you know better than, I guess, just, guessing, or um uh like not having any, like, actual quantitative way to forecast, because it's a bit unsatisfying and probably worrying if that unexpected healthcare costs can arise, and this just kind of like, well, the future is so uncertain, like there's just unknowable. Like, is there, I guess, what suggestions might you have for somebody who's, say, 45, they're in a fortunate position that they can't retire early, maybe they're 50, and so they still have a bit of time before they get to Medicare. Are there things they can do, actions they can take, like analyses they can do? Maybe it's like run their 23andMe, analysis to see what their, what might be hereditary for them, etc. I'm just kind of curious to get your thoughts on things that, actions that would-be retirees can take if they're retiring early.
Yeah, I mean, definitely see where you're going with that, and think it's important to kind of try to get a handle on what you're facing risk wise. I mean, me personally, I want to make sure that I can afford the out of pocket max, on an exchange plan for the foreseeable future, and sort of take maybe a 4% inflation rate on that roughly. I think probably healthcare inflation. I mean, at least prescription drug inflation has been quite low for years now. People don't have that in their mind, but generic drugs especially have been falling in price pretty dramatically over the last decade. I think there's reason to believe that healthcare inflation won't be significantly higher than overall inflation. At least lately, it's been lower than overall inflation. Of course, overall inflation has been really high. So, I mean, I would say being able to look at that out of pocket max each calendar year ongoing is definitely plenty of cushion to sort of deal with uncertainties. If I would say that the threshold where maybe it would be, okay, I don't have that much money set aside to cover that, okay, and still have my other budget items covered, then what? Then I think it just comes down to adapting to what comes your way, and just how adaptable you are as a person is going to drive how well you can navigate the healthcare landscape, whether that's, being willing to take a flight to Canada, Singapore, another country, developed country, to import 90 days of drugs, here and there, if you get a really expensive, drug that you have to take, and you can't afford the prices in the US, or if you need to have a procedure done, again, look at those developed countries that have really great healthcare systems, and if you're flexible and willing to navigate, what comes your way, I think there's plenty of options for really inexpensive care globally, whether it's, Singapore, Taiwan. Depends on the situation, depends on the condition, depends on what you need, but I think that's definitely a a good route for most people. I think there are people out there who are pretty wed to, a given healthcare system within the United States. I had two great grandfathers who graduated from Vanderbilt Medical School, and had one from Johns Hopkins in the family, and these different prestigious universities. Oftentimes family members will say, "Oh, I'm only going there. That's all I'm going to do." And if that's you, then you do need to set aside more money. Frankly, you just you're going to have to have more of a cushion, because there are a lot more um, outliers in terms of cost in the US than other places. With a single payer, you've just got more gamesmanship in the US in terms of the insurance landscape as such, where it's very similar to higher education, where you Princeton and Yale and Harvard are all racing to have the highest sticker price so that they can then give you the biggest scholarship, to make it seem like, okay, I'm signaling that I've got great quality here and the net cost is lower than anywhere else. The insurers are all kind of racing. There's no incentive to sort of put pressure on lowering prices. They're just more concerned with demonstrating savings, and also there's a lot of rebate schemes involved that there is legislation kind of trying to limit now going forward. But in past years, it was totally common for a pharmacy benefit manager, to cover a way more expensive drug on their formulary or their approved drug list, and then just demand a rebate from the manufacturer of a certain percentage of that money. And so it was more profitable for the insurer to do that than to actually try to squeeze or to try to lower prices overall. And so it's similar in higher education. There's huge tuition inflation, right? But it's not the net cost that's inflating quite that high. In fact, the net cost is pretty reasonable because that's really tied to what people can afford.
Mhm.
So I think there's definitely reasons to be optimistic. I mean, a lot of it has to do with how flexible and how adaptable you are. And I think most early retirees generally fit into the camp of more adaptable, more flexible, just because the behaviors that get you to that situation in many cases are sort of being budget conscious, you know, being able to sort of look at, whether that's, at the grocery store, looking at different options, looking at for the best value, being value conscious in general is like super important in healthcare. So if you just understand sort of what things cost and you're just aware of your situation and being adaptable, I think that's, there's, of course you have to educate yourself like in anything complicated. You have to take the steps to educate yourself. But in general, if you're value conscious and paying attention to quality and not just looking at the sticker price as an indication of quality, I think there's reasons to be optimistic for sure.
Makes sense. What are I guess, what are common mistakes that you have observed that retirees often make when it comes to planning for their health insurance needs in retirement? You kind of alluded to some examples earlier in our discussion, but I was wondering if there are specific things that you saw come up actually over and over again that you know you would advise to somebody who's contemplating retirement to think about, perhaps earlier.
It's a good question. Honestly, the most common thing I saw was people being unwilling to retire early because of health insurance costs. Basically people saying, I'm going to work until Medicare age, even if they were really financially prepared otherwise to cut ties with their job, a couple of years earlier. It's amazing, just the fear involved with that decision and wanting something more. Medicare definitely feels more predictable and stable than sort of the ACA landscape, and the sort of stigma, at least in the South, the stigma of Obamacare, is definitely something I face for sure. People just not being willing to even participate in the exchange, for just, I wouldn't say political reasons, just sort of just the uncertainties around it, the exit and entrance of different insurers year to year. Oftentimes, certain states, um, and this has changed, but a couple of years ago, Alabama only had Blue Cross Blue Shield of Alabama as the only insurer on their exchange, and so people said, "Well, I had a bad experience with them, and I'm just not going to use them," and a lot of people just unwilling to part with the employer-based coverage they had, out of the fear of the unknown, basically. Um, Beyond that, common mistakes. That's what we were asking, right?
Yeah, that you had observed in your actual practice.
Well, I mean, I didn't really see that many mistakes because that was sort of the reason for us being involved, right? Is like, hey,
Mhm.
here's my client. They don't know what to do. Tell them what to do. And then our job was not to make a mistake. So, frankly, I can't say that I really saw many mistakes other than, people coming to me with an emergency, like the girl who got pregnant who didn't have health insurance, just not having health insurance in general.
Or maybe
Uh,
framed a different way, were there common things that you saw clients come to you with where they were ignorant, they just didn't know, and after they had consulted with you, it had actually changed the way they, maybe some decisions that they were going to make, and like especially if that happened over and over again. I just yeah, just kind of curious your thoughts there.
well, I can think of maybe one example that was fairly common. Oftentimes, I saw people using health sharing arrangements, um, through like a Christian ministry, or one of these sort of outfits um, that was very common where people were doing that as a cost saving measure, where they'd rather spend $100 or $200 a month and be involved in sort of those sharing arrangements rather than having like a contractually based health insurance benefit. And so I would generally classify that as a mistake, in terms of just not. It's fine if you understand what it is, but once you kind of peel back the layers and realize this is not a contractual obligation, this is the kindness of a group of people's hearts, and a lot of administrative bureaucracy sort of dictating when I'm going to pay my providers. In general, I did sway some people away from that once they realized some of the problems with the claims processing delays. Just a lot of providers just don't like it taking a year to get paid for something. So that's one big issue with those arrangements. But just generally speaking, I think having a contract that says this is what services are covered and this is what I'm paying for those services is valuable from a planning standpoint, just to kind of understand, what your risk exposure is. So that would be probably up there in terms of a common either misunderstanding, misconception, or just maybe not seeing the full picture.
Yeah, makes sense. And something you said like earlier, uh uh, I hadn't considered before, but I was just kind of curious to follow up on it. You mentioned that, like I personally, I totally get like um in a lot of more maybe conservative leaning states, there's just more inherent, I guess, I don't know, skepticism about the Affordable Care Act plans, like setting politics aside, like it is what it is. But the thing I guess I hadn't considered before was that somebody who is working in a job who might otherwise be financially ready to retire and have a valid option on the ACA marketplace, uh, might still not, again, not for political reasons, but might just not quite feel confident or not trust the idea of jumping off their employer plan, which they know are maybe familiar with, going onto a marketplace plan, and that might be the thing that actually, but for that thing they would retire, and that might be the thing that actually prevents them from retiring because they feel like they don't have that peace of mind. How, I guess, is that really common? I could see that happening, but I was just, I guess I was surprised that that would prevent a lot of people uh from retiring, because those are health insurance plans. They're not health ministries. They're contractual. They're only for a year. You have to renew it. You have to renew next year. They may not be there next year, but there might be different options next year. But they are like bona fide health insurance plans. And so yeah, that's why I was kind of curious to get your thoughts on, how common it was, and also is that more perception or is it born based in like born out of reality? Like they try to get reimbursed for something and they have troubles with it during the reimbursement process, and it's a real hassle, so they don't trust it because they have had actual really bad experiences.
Um, I think most of it's fear based, and I think it's more common to have that concern when you're already pretty close to calling it quits and you don't have all that time till Medicare or another option comes available. But how legitimate is that fear? Just broadly speaking, um, you know, depends on what resources you have, probably. Um, I think if you were doing the lean fire thing and really, really trying to live on a really slim budget, it might be a little bit harder to pull that trigger. Just the way that basically it depends on the market. Honestly, I mean, but a state like Tennessee, it's interesting. If you had a chronic condition, it would be a little bit scarier here. Where you've got Farm Bureau who's really successful in this market, charges maybe for high deductible plan with a $3,000 or so out of pocket max. You might spend a 35-year-old might spend $120 a month or something for that plan, just a third of the cost of other options that are available on the exchange. They're essentially cream skimming, right, all the healthy people out of the pool and leaving less healthy people on the exchange, and that's going to drive up costs over time, depending on how popular Farm Bureau becomes over time, and versus the ACA plans, and so I mean that it is somewhat legitimate if you really are marginally prepared, financially. You can start to kind of see, okay, maybe in a market like that, if I've got a chronic condition that's expensive, maybe those premiums are going to, and out-of-pocket maximums, maybe they are going to rise quite a bit faster than what it might in another state.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, if you're marginally prepared financially, you probably have a marginal income as well, in which case you get really generous subsidies. And there's definitely a lot of gamesmanship in different markets, and it's quite interesting. Part of what creates a lot of fear in people's minds is there's only one insurance company on my exchange in my state, or there's only two insurance companies on my exchange in my state. Part of that, when it drops down to one, can be quite, if you don't have a ton of income, can be actually a great thing as long as you're somewhat flexible in your networks, because all of a sudden now that insurer, like Blue Cross Blue Shield of Alabama, when they were the only insurer in Alabama in past years, they could dictate what their benchmark plan price was because they were the only insurer on that exchange. And so if the listeners aren't familiar with what that means, it's the second cheapest silver plan in your market. So that drives the subsidy calculation for all plans on the exchange. And so you could set that artificially high to increase the subsidy for everything else. And they often appear to do that. So lots of states, insurers have kind of figured out the math, kind of figure out, okay, well, if I'm the only insurer and it's the second cheapest silver plan in the market that drives the subsidy calculation for everything else and drives the net cost of every other plan down, then I'll just make my exchange, I'll offer two silver plans. One will be cheap and one will be really expensive. And that expensive plan will drive a lower net price for every other plan. And so, that gamesmanship, it strikes fear in people's mind in terms of, oh gosh, I've only got one option, and what happens in the future when they drop out or there's some other cataclysmic event in the market. Ultimately, some of that is actually quite beneficial for the insurer and actually encourages them to continue offering the plan in the market. So that's why you really, even though there's been news articles really since the ACA was passed about different markets losing all insurer options in the market, I don't think that'll ever happen, just because of how advantageous it is to be the only insurer in the market. You sort of just can engage in that sort of gamesmanship. Now, I don't agree with it. I don't agree with how the law is written, but they understand the way the law is written, and they I think will continue offering an option for people who are early retirees. And I mean, when it first was passed, I definitely was super excited. I mean, that was a big fear of mine. And once the Affordable Care Act became an option, I sort of felt like, okay, now I can, be an early retiree and not really have to worry. And I think in general, for anybody in sort of that, average early retiree span of wealth, probably if you're over 10 million in wealth, then you really have to think about the cost. But then again, you've got more income and wealth, so maybe you don't really care about the cost as much. So I think it's a great. I mean, it's great. It's a great option that didn't exist before that now does. Of course, in theory, you could have been responsible, gotten your coverage before becoming ill, and retain your coverage. But the fact that health insurance is oftentimes tied to the employer, in the U.S., that not a lot of good ideas can come about when you've got that those main building blocks in place already. Those kind of legacy features of our system are just going to kind of create a lot of problems. I mean, I think in general, if you just divorced, that relationship of corporate America sort of subsidizing our healthcare system, and you just sort of either mandated or encouraged through subsidies, people getting coverage early before they get sick and maintaining that coverage through time, it'd be a whole lot cheaper
Yeah,
overall.
it would.
But
Yeah, and it is true. I think especially for the early retirement community, the introduction of the ACA marketplace has like opened up an entirely new way for would-be early retirees to actually maybe develop a little more confidence, because it is a real option. It doesn't mean that the plans are necessarily the best, but it does mean that you probably have an option so that you won't go medically bankrupt. You won't like lose your shirt because you thought you were going to be okay in retirement, but you know, prior to the ACA, there were like lifetime caps, or it was just you maybe whatever couldn't qualify for whatever reason, and then so you're just kind of walking through the desert, hoping that you have enough to make it to the other side. But the ACA, at least for all its faults, does seem to fill that need. And I'm also just kind of curious. Yeah, have you heard of like Mark Cuban's Cost Plus
yeah,
pharmacy?
the pharmacy, yeah.
Yeah, because so much of insurance costs is driven by um it, for patients who do not have to go to see a human doctor or to see a human at a provider center. Like if you need to get dialysis, that's not a drug, that's a service, right? But like if you have a chronic condition for which you take an expensive drug, like you gave the example of I forgot the name of it, the Alzheimer's drug that dipped Medicare prices year over year 3%, just that one drug. Like drugs can be very expensive. I'm just kind of curious, like right now, Cost Plus is not yet like at scale, but they're growing rapidly. Um, like how big of an impact do you think that could have in the broader way that I mean, if they really are successful nationally, like how big of an impact do you foresee that having in the broader insurance, like health insurance market for retirees, for early retirees? Uh, yeah, kind of curious to get your thoughts there.
It Unfortunately, I like the idea of trying to address the problems. So like the Cost Plus idea, I think has gotten a lot of attention because everybody's sort of frustrated with how opaque and frustrating and well non-market driven our healthcare market is, right? That's non-price driven. It's just a opaque. Um, well, it's a market failure essentially. Um, there's no determining price versus value. It's just arbitrary, right? All the prices are sort of arbitrary events from one cause or another, lots of different causes. But I don't really see it making a meaningful difference simply because they're oftentimes going to be more expensive than other alternatives for a lot of drugs. And for those few drugs that are super expensive, patients wouldn't want to pay the cash price. You know, they're just, it's sort of, it's not in the insurer's best interest to um, allow that model either. Unfortunately, the pharmacy benefit industry is such that they're willing to allow pharmacies to make an exorbitant amount of money on some scripts and then lose a lot of money on other scripts, and keeps the whole machine humming, right? Like, it keeps them with the profits they want to achieve. And, you know, on the whole, pharmacies are able to, I mean, when you sort of rank, I guess, 32 major industries in the US, pharmacy is really ranked near the bottom, you know, two of 32 major industries for, in terms of gross profit margin, for quite a while, probably since the early 2000s. And I think that means that they're still making money, though. You know, they're still existing. But you look at, you know, salaries of pharmacists. I don't know your wife's situation, but probably you're more in tune with the pharmacy market in general. You know, wage inflation has been, you know, negative for about a decade in that industry. There's a lot of margin pressures in pharmacy. It's not what the public thinks in terms of this, you know, hey, you know, drugs are expensive, so the pharmacists and the pharmacies are making tons of money. That's just not the case. Most of the time, they're super overly efficient operations that are just barely surviving. And so I don't think the cost plus thing. I mean, if that were the alternative, if that were wholesale, we scrap everything and just start with that model, then yeah, it would succeed and be better than what we have now. But unfortunately, I don't see a way for them to take market share, because the consumer who's ultimately deciding on what the best option is price wise is not going to opt for that. You know, most pharmacies for most drugs are, there's a lot of drugs that are losing money when you talk about just the labor cost per prescription and so forth. You know, oftentimes if the labor cost is, you know, even at an efficient operation, you know, if it's $3 per prescription, and, you know, CVS Caremark is reimbursing 50 cents in total for the supplies, the drug that goes in the bottle, and everything for a generic drug, the cost plus model is just not going to steer someone, you know, away from what ends up being a great deal for the consumer, you know, in that PBM, you know, traditional model that we have now. But also, you know, they're going to get a generic drug where, you know, the pharmacy's making $2,000, you know, on something that there really is no justification for it whatsoever. It's more or less just offsetting losses elsewhere. And that's sort of the problem, is that, you know, again, price is not really operating as in the way that it should in driving consumer choices, right? Like, the price is sort of hidden from view, and sort of, I like the idea of making it more transparent. You know, I like the idea of like the websites like Healthcare Blue Book, you know, and some of these other, there's several out there where MetaBid, where you can go in and sort of, you know, bid for procedures. You know, if you want a procedure for X, Y, and Z, you don't want a colonoscopy and you want to pay cash, you know, you want to get it cheaper than insurance rate, you know, and cut out the middleman. All those ideas are good, you know, in terms of trying to restore some price into the system to where people can make value judgments like any other functioning market. But you look at, you know, the problem markets in the US, education and healthcare, they just, that pricing mechanism is just gone, right, and hidden.
Interesting.
So I think, I don't think it'll be successful, unfortunately, but I'm all for those efforts to try to put the consumer in charge of their healthcare decisions. I mean, The high deductible health plans and the HSA movement is a good one, but ultimately, so much spending happens after the deductible is met, that out of pocket is met, with the fact that a very small percentage of our population is driving the spending predominantly. That really, how much you pay for an out of pocket service underneath your out of pocket max. When you're going to the doctor for your annual checkup, or you're going to a specialist once a year for a minor issue, those just, that's not what's driving the cost of our healthcare system, right? So we just need to do a better job of taking care of people who are very sick, and also giving some pricing mechanism in that situation, whether that's facing some, even if it's not cost, facing some incentive or disincentive to engage in a value-based choice is what we have to do. Yeah, policy wise, that's not happening. There's a lot of interest that would have anything happen besides that, just because any profit margin on a big price is better for insurers, than having a much lower cost and a higher profit margin. So
That's interesting. Okay.
Drugs are an example of that, right? I mean, there's been huge price declines in generic drugs over time, but that's because they have to compete. There's lots of different generic manufacturers out there. The largest one, Teva, might only have 10 or 20% market share, so it's hugely competitive. And when you have real competition, and you have the buyers of generic pharmaceuticals, your big companies like your wholesalers, or your CVS's, your Walgreens, they decide on the best price, right? They have there's a incentive for them to do so, right? They make more money if they pay less for those things. And so when you have a functioning market, you get a good outcome. So it's really just certain brand drugs, certain services, and that where it just shocks you, where one hospital with a great reputation charges half the price of a lesser hospital with a poor reputation, and or vice versa. It's just there's no price and value are not joined at the hip, like in most features of life, I guess.
Yeah. Earlier you were talking about I think you were alluding to the idea of medical tourism, like that could be one element of strategy for covering your healthcare needs in retirement. And I was just kind of curious, how might how do you view medical tourism for early retirees in terms of how it might play a role in their healthcare planning? Do you recommend medical tourism for certain types of care in particular, or even certain profiles of customers or patients?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I wouldn't make any blanket recommendations for everyone. I would leave it up to the individual and their comfort level with that. But I certainly am quite comfortable with it, and my own experience has been positive. With either anecdotally from people I've talked to, or I went to El Salvador this year, for my cousin's wedding, and had to get a COVID test done, and was super impressed with efficiency, and what would typically be considered a developing country. Really low cost, really efficient, better than the for that particular service was better than my experience in the US. And so better value, better result, better, every aspect of it was better. But obviously that's a COVID test. It's not open heart surgery. And so it's difficult to really assess value, right? So many people do it based on reputation. They talk to colleagues, okay, if I'm having some major medical procedure done, who do I trust to do that? And I do think it would be nice if there were more readily available benchmarks that, sort of indicated quality to the consumer. There are some things out there, definitely that's one benefit to certain insurers, is that they do sort of track some metrics like that. Blue Cross has been pretty in different states has been pretty um, valuable in terms of trying to assess providers. In most cases they're measuring things that also impact their bottom line, like they're looking at, okay, how well, the important things that are, okay, how well does this person adhere to evidence-based medicine sort of benchmarks? Are they immunizing their patients at a acceptable rate? Are they recommending colonoscopies at the appropriate age? Or there's various things that help them control costs and that also indicate quality. But again, that's a very personal decision too, because a lot of people, they're just not. I'm definitely wired as someone who cares about evidence-based medicine and cares about what the science says is good medical care, and I'm not as impressed with the warm relationship or the how friendly my provider is, or that sort of thing. But people, I've definitely learned that people do not agree with that. There's plenty of people who really only care about bedside manner, and they don't care at all whatsoever. They're going to trust that person. And there's maybe some evidence that just having a good trusted relationship and acting on that person's advice, even if it's not absolutely optimal, that can be valuable too, right? So in terms of improving people's health. So different strokes for different folks. I mean, I would say for sure that's a very personal decision. So
All right. Well, this has been really insightful. I've really enjoyed the conversation. But where can people find out more about you and what you're up to?
well, I'm not super active on social media, but certainly if anybody wanted to message me on LinkedIn or something, my handle's legal drug dealer. And on Facebook, you just look up my name and send me a message, and I'll probably see it at some point.
All right. Well, really appreciate your taking the time to chat with us today, and thanks so much for sharing your insights and experience with us.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Nice
Take
meeting you
care.
in